Hello everybody, welcome into Great Atmosphere here on January 22nd of 2024. Just wanted to get started by looking at the contiguous US true color satellite imagery. And it's good. This is the last time that we're going to be seeing sunshine here in the southeast for the better part of excuse me, about 7 days. You can see, generally speaking, we have some snow-covered hills and low mountains in the Tennessee and Ohio River Valley in general. But our big troublemaker is starting to take shape, as we discussed last week. High pressure has built over the southeast and the eastern parts of the United States over the weekend, brought some pretty chilly weather, not necessarily as record-breaking as we might have once believed, but ultimately it's starting to ship out to sea, and whenever we get high pressure out into the Atlantic, directly to our east, that's when the Gulf opens up, and we see that already taking place here across the Texarkana and Mississippi River Valley regions. Just wanted to take a look at those record-breaking temperatures as they happened. You can see this is starting... This should be starting in the past week. Let me make sure that that is correct. We should see some stuff start to pop up here. Let me get to past week. There we go. There it is. So that was last week's cold snap came through, and we saw a little bit of a push, a little bit of a reprieve after that, and then our cold air we experienced pushed its way through the Tennessee regions. We saw some records tied for record lows in the southeast, but ultimately it wasn't as bad as originally thought. So that's good news, but it still definitely reached below 15 or so degrees wind chill, at least here in Charlotte. Quite cold conditions, but not breaking record books. Not necessarily saying that breaking a record book constitutes a significant event. It was very, very cold, but ultimately not as severe as some may have once believed. So this is currently looking at our radar reflectivity. We see the Gulf Stream has begun to... Not the Gulf Stream, the Gulf of Mexico has begun to open up. We have a good amount of high pressure that's building off around right here. High pressure moves in this general motion, which ultimately brings the moisture and warmth from the Gulf. And then we also have high pressure ridging that exists out over the Dakotas, and doing the same kind of thing like this. We see that we're getting cold air advected in from the cold continental air mass that's going to be squeezing the warm moist air that is over the Gulf, and this becomes quite the problem area for this particular region going into today. Quite significant icing in these areas. I've already seen several videos of tractor trailers along interstate highways that were not aware of the potential icing situation, made very quickly aware. But that is our current dominant pattern. Two high pressures going up against one another, and in the middle we have our moisture stream that is making its way into the U.S. And unfortunately for us, that high pressure is going to be quite virulent, and it'll be pretty much right off our coast for the better part of 5 to 7, potentially even more days, with nothing really on the back end that's going to be helping to push it out by any means either. Any high pressure that does form is going to just work to dry out this region of the Tennessee River Valley, and ultimately more of that moisture is just going to continue to gradually get invected over into the deep southeast and to the Carolinas. So that's really the pattern that's in place. And then we have the West Coast is continuously still being inundated with the North Pacific jet extension. That should be the extension should be actually strengthening over the next few days. So we should expect more precipitation coming off the West Coast, or coming onto the West Coast. There's actually some severe thunderstorm warning. A severe thunderstorm warning actually got placed this morning in San Diego County, first one in quite a long time that's happened for that particular region, and that area is very prone to flooding since it's not used to having such high precipitation totals in that of itself. So they're going through it currently at the moment. Snake River Valley continues to get inundated with both wintry and otherwise precipitation, and the Olympic Mountains in Washington continue to be inundated as well. So the main story is actually going to be this week the obviously the temperature, the rainfall, but also the temperatures. So we look at the day 5 to 10 anomalies. A couple things I want to point out. So we have in the Canadian Prairie, we have high pressure that is obviously dominating in this particular region, and that is ultimately going to serve to increase the amount of, and because it's getting advected warm air all the way up into it from the Gulf and otherwise. And also we have the same thing happening right here over the Bering Strait in Alaska, and then we also have Greenland. So all this is ultimately working to bring as much warm air as possible up into the Canadian Prairie. So it's going to be a warm next 10 days at least, and then even I think we actually go a little bit further in time, out to 15 days, and is about the same thing as well. That's currently what the current guidance is at least suggesting, and it mainly has to do with that situation where we have just cold air blocked up in Greenland, and we have cold air blocked up in Alaska, and that ultimately serves to warm up the North American subcontinent quite significantly, while also bringing in a good amount of moisture into the west coast and the southeast as well. Could see a little bit of drying in the northern plains, but I'm sure that they'll actually probably be okay with that. They've been under the gun with some pretty crazy winter weather over the past couple of weeks. They could probably use a little bit of more mild, dry air. But taking a look at what this looks like in terms of the anomaly across the world, we have our two coldest areas in the entire world are in Greenland and Alaska at the moment in terms of relative temperature anomaly. But everywhere else, specifically all of Canada and North America, Europe specifically is quite warm. Most of Siberia is warm. Only areas that are experiencing cold are areas where there's tropical systems due to the Madden-Julian Oscillation is currently sitting right on top of Indonesia in phase 5, and the Indian Ocean dipole is currently in negative. So this particular region in over northern Australia is having one of its more intense tropical seasons as they get into the heart of their hurricane season. We also have another tropical system that's been sitting off of Mauritius and near Madagascar, and we always have a subtropical low that makes its way into southern Brazil and Uruguay in that particular region, actually really helping the crops that are trying to continue to grow before harvesting here in the next couple of months. But overall, it's generally a very warm atmosphere that everyone is experiencing for the most part, but obviously where we see the most big disparities in temperatures, where we would expect to see the most dynamic meteorological systems take place as well. So you see this particular gradient here actually brought a very strong storm system, tropical storm force winds into the northern British Isles. I know Ireland and Scotland received some crazy winds that actually brought a good bit of damage to that particular region over the weekend. So definitely need to be paying a lot of attention into these particular regions of temperature anomalies, just because they ultimately are the main drivers for big severe weather. So we move forward into what we see currently. We see that high pressure sitting right over the eastern North Carolina coastal plain right now, and ultimately that you can see that reflected in the wind barbs. You see off the Atlantic Gulf Stream, and then beginning to make its way up into the Gulf from the Gulf into the Mississippi River Valley. We see our ridging in place right here. That's ultimately bringing in some very light winds at the surface, but ultimately serving to bring in cold air underneath, or actually cold air aloft, pardon me, that will sink going down into the Mississippi River Valley to meet the moisture and ultimately create that icing situation. Also have a little bit of a panhandle low that's trying to form right here. Ultimately, I don't think that's going to be the longest lived system, just because we do have that high pressure ridge building in, and ultimately anything, it will probably serve to advect and start moving in this general direction and be the main driver for moving this high off into the coast and bringing even more moisture into the southeast. Taking a look at our snowfall map that we experienced over the past 3 days, you notice that our initial thinking very early in the week last week had most of the snow being up in the New York City, Connecticut region, northern Jersey, The Poconos Mountains, that got shifted a little bit further down into northern Delaware, South Jersey, and the D.C. area. Ultimately, no one is happy about that in New York. I believe New York still hasn't gotten appreciable snowfall. I think it's the only major metro in the Northeast that has yet to get some. And it's still got a tenth or maybe an even inch in some spots in that megalopolis region. But ultimately, not a lot to write home about from New York City, but certainly D.C. Got its fair share. And then we had orographic lift induced snowfall in the West Virginian Appalachian Allegheny Mountains, and lake effect snow in full effect across any region that faced a northwestern coast of a lake. Pretty much experienced a good amount of snowfall, with even this particular region being the main culprit behind the mesovortices, or at least the end result of the mesovortices that we saw last week going down along the spine of Lake Michigan. So that was what we experienced the past 72 hours in terms of snowfall. Taking a look at our current temperatures, quite mild across the region. We obviously expect towards the end of the week that the southeast should get up to the mid-60s, maybe the low 70s in some regions, particularly along the Carolinas and northern Georgia. So quite different for what we experience here in mid-January of all things. I know a lot of people are saying that this is a sign that spring is on the way, and Groundhog Day coming up. This is a sign that's going to be an early spring. I wouldn't get my hopes up about that in particular. I think this is just a highly dynamic season. So ultimately, it's just the pattern that we're currently in. About every 10, 14 days, there seems to be a general shift in the North American general synoptic pattern, and this quite significant warm-up that we're experiencing is kind of the inverse of the significant cold that we've experienced over the middle parts of January. Moving ahead to what are we looking at? There we go. I just wanted to kind of emphasize the cloud cover that we're in line to experience. So if you see any whites, that simulates cloud cover, and any grays would kind of be broken clouds. And if you can see through and see the ocean and see the green, that means you would expect clear skies. It's like a top-down view of what the models predict. And so this goes through into Monday, today, and then clouds start to roll in, strato Q, and then by the end of today, from midnight Tuesday on, it is pretty much fully white in terms of cloud cover here in the southeast until we get to some breaks potentially Saturday, maybe. Nope. Sunday. All right. Now, this time next week. So it's going to be pretty dreary here in the southeast, and there might be some severe threats, and we'll get into that here in a second, towards the end of the week. But ultimately, just like mild rain off and on is kind of is in the main equation here over the southeast next couple of weeks. Nothing too terribly exciting, not a lot of main rainfall either. It's just going to be mild and dreary, unfortunately, as we go forward. We can look at what the GFS is predicting in terms of total precipitation. Charlotte's looking at about 2 inches, 3 inches up in the Virginia Highlands, and then you get towards the Gulf Coast, and that's where you see big convective modes where you would get up to 6-7 inches over the course of 7 days. So, and most of that will be front loaded towards the middle parts of this week. So certainly some flooding threats in the deep south, but it's generally speaking going to be quite wet, but not a huge flooding risk by any means across the entirety of the southeast and the Ohio River Valley up into the mid-Atlantic states. It'll just be mild and dreary and rainy for the most part. I unfortunately have to report there. So let's take a look at what this looks like in terms of our mid-levels. So we see going into tonight and tomorrow, the high pressure sitting off of the Atlantic coast down here, advecting in warm Gulf air. Ridging starts to even out over the course, and this becomes the dominant move maker, I suppose, in the eastern parts of the U.S. We see some shortwave perturbations here in the Texarkana region which might be able to set off a marginal risk, I would say, of some severe weather. I don't think shear is the main issue in this particular region. We can maybe see, but ultimately any severe weather, obviously you need the moisture, you need the energy, and you need the wind. You need wind shear in order to spark these systems off. So ultimately, right now we're looking at the overall wind speeds in the mid to lower levels. You can see that there isn't so much in the way of intense. There isn't a big streak by any means going through this, so there isn't a lot of advection that's being forced into this. We can maybe look at the upper levels to see a little bit of a better idea of what was the primary forcing for the trough in the earlier parts of the week. So we have a little bit of a dip, but ultimately not a very significant streak. And if there's not a lot of ascent, we can expect that there probably would not be a significant amount of lift necessary to create a lot of convection in the Mississippi River Valley. This is kind of just a giant moisture rain shield that this is primarily simulating in this respect. And as that moves forward, you see it gradually shifts forward over time. You see a little bit more of an upper level low that forms later on the week as everything starts to shift out into the sea. This is at the end of 7 days as well, so 144 hours in the future, and that's ultimately when we would expect this main system of rain and moist mugginess to get out. And you can see that reflected here in the precipitable water. It starts out with dry air in the southeast, and then we slowly start to move in, and you see how long that this warm, humid air just sits over us and stews. This is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday still, Saturday, getting a little bit better, and then you'll see at the end, we'll have our big final cold front that pushes in towards Sunday, Monday next week. That ultimately brings us back into the typical cold, dry winter air that we would experience here in the southeast. So it's pretty consistent across the board now that it's not going to be the greatest of weeks in terms of outdoor activities or outdoor weather by any means, unfortunately. Take a look at some of the energy forcing going into this. Is looking at next weekend. There really isn't anything to write home about in terms of severe weather going forward through the course of the week. It's just this main thing that the main system that's going to push out the majority of this instability or mugginess and raininess is going to ultimately be this system that comes in on Saturday and Sunday. We'll definitely be taking a look at this for the majority of the week this week to see what that looks like. Will this be a negatively tilted trough or a positively tilted trough? That'll ultimately kind of determine what forcing is available, and see in anything. I wouldn't expect it to be, well, there could be a little bit of a discrete convective mode if we get enough lift out in front of it. That would be ultimately very good for it. And if we have a negatively tilted trough, that would be even better in terms of getting some kind of fun thunderstorm. But ultimately speaking, it's going to be this most likely QLCS squall line feature that will start forming in the latter parts of the weekend before this all pushes out and we move forward into the next week. So taking a look at what this looks like from the snow point of view, just wanted to review this from earlier. Anything in red has not received any snowfall, and anything in blue has received over 100% their typical snowfall for where we currently stand season to date. Ultimately, we have this little pocket right here through Tennessee. Tennessee's gotten quite a bit of snow in the Central Plains as well. This is interesting down here in the Dallas, Texas region, Texarkana. This is a pseudo lake effect region that the area has actually seen due to some of the bigger reservoirs in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that actually produce some snow in that particular region. This is snowfall, not ice. So that's one indicator to go for here. So pretty interesting to see those little pockets right there. And we see quite a big gradient in the central coastal plain of Virginia before we get up there. Anything in white they're currently at their average. So you see the system that dumped over northern Delaware, Maryland, and the Philadelphia region. certainly brought this area more into the blue, more above average. And you can see New York and Long Island and southern Connecticut and even eastern Mass. And even the upstate of New York is generally majority red. So it seems like it's been a pretty snowy area, but it's only been snowy for a specific number of regions. Snake River Valley and the Cascadian Plateau quite a bit. Northern regions of the Four Corner states as well. So it's just interesting to see, because this will ultimately, we'll look at this at the end of winter to kind of determine where the ultimate snowpack is that'll provide a lot of the moisture that crops need in order to grow. In this respect, and just for water resources in general, this is very important. So problem areas are definitely in the Dakotas and Montana, Minnesota, northern Wisconsin. Those areas certainly need to kind of get their snowpack more in place from what they're usually expecting in order for them to be on the right side of things going into the spring. Taking a look at our North Pacific Jet phase diagram that we talked about this last week, ultimately, whenever the jet is primarily favoring an extension, that usually means more unsettled weather here in the States. And whenever we have a retraction, it means that we have a little bit more mild and normal, very calm weather here in the States. And over the next couple of days, we're going to be seeing a little bit more of that extension. So obviously, we've been predicting, more unsettled weather, a lot of disturbances in terms of moisture, and ultimately just just bad weather in general, unsettled, unstable weather going forward over the course of time. But I will say that looking beyond this, it seems that a retraction is currently forecasted to become in place, and I believe I could find where this is. There we go. So going forward, this is over the next. Let's see where we are. Yep, this is end of next week. So the extension, where we're looking at for the North Pacific Jet diagram, is ultimately we want this primary region right in here. I don't need a sand. We need this primary main streak to be further towards California so that it can overspread like you currently see, and that ultimately brings about more moisture in from the Gulf and cold air in from the Canadian prairie. And you can see what the end result is. You see a lot of air mass just located over Alaska, and then you see over Greenland up to the very top right of the screen. It has a pretty strong gradient there as well. And as we move forward into the future, as we move forward into February, you can see that the jet actually starts to peter out quite a bit, and the majority of it starts to become mainly in the western Pacific region, so it's more of a retraction over the course of the entire North Pacific. Now, what does that ultimately do? Well, ultimately, it begins to develop, instead of ridges that form like this, we have lee-side lows of the Rocky Mountains that begin to form, like this bad boy right here. Once we have these lows come in, then we get a majority of cold air that comes in at the same time that we have moisture come in from the south, and ultimately it freezes the Midwest, and it brings adequate moisture to the East Coast, and this is ultimately kind of what we would expect if we were to ever have a Miller type A or B storm come in through the southeast. So this is why I'm not entirely sold that this is the beginning of an early spring by any means, because if the North Pacific Jet decides to retract as fully as the GFS at least is expecting here over the next, or at least in the beginning parts of February, that ultimately brings about a new bout of unsettled and unstable weather that also brings in the cold air that is sufficient for us to refreeze going into the. So this is all part of that two-week plan, ultimately, and you can see the end result of this. You'll see a lot of cold air. And this is a height anomaly, so bear that in mind. But everything is focused over Alaska and Greenland, and then as we move forward, as that North Pacific Jet starts to retract, we get more lee-side lows. So you start to see the blues start to show up again. That simulates a lot more instability in the total of the south, and you see these little dips in the stream as well over the Texas Panhandle. That ultimately is an indicator that we're going to start getting more successive lows, kind of like we had the past couple of weeks where it seemed like there was one big system after another. Well, this is kind of like the preliminary setup, and this is very, very far out in advance, by the way. This is probably way too far out to actually be looking at this, but this is just what, as we always say, you gotta take into account everything, so you can never be surprised by anything when it comes your way, or at least have a good context of what is generally to be expected. And this is ultimately, when looking at such a big analog that the North Pacific Jet, or a teleconnection that the North Pacific Jet has, along with the Pacific meridional flow and the Pacific multi-decadal oscillation that's currently quite negative. Those kind of things are all things that you look to in order to kind of make these long-term plans. And especially, everyone kind of needs to know when spring will start. Ultimately, it's a huge driving commodities factor here in the U.S., if not around the world. So the higher, we play a probability game, and in this respect, this is currently what we're looking at in terms of a pattern. So like every 10 to 14 days, we're going to be kind of going back and forth based off the oscillations that we're currently seeing. So that's currently what we're looking at. Nothing too entirely crazy, but ultimately that is what we are expecting here. Once again, my name is Zach for Grid Atmosphere. I appreciate you tuning in. I would appreciate your subscription, specifically if you live here in the Southeast U.S. I'll be making a weather forecasting video regarding a wide range of topics that affect our weather here every weekday for the foreseeable future. So once again, I appreciate you tuning in, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Bye-bye.